Have you ever thought about a war that lasts so long it outlives everyone who started it? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. The legendary Hundred Years' War between England and France. But, there's a funny thing about that name. Yeah, it wasn't 100 years. It was actually 116, from 1337 all the way to 1453. Just think about that. That's way more than a single lifetime. We're talking about a conflict so long that the great-grandchildren of the first soldiers were fighting the exact same war. So the big question is, how on earth does a war even start, let alone last for over a century? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was more like a series of dominoes, each one tipping over and pushing England and France closer and closer to a conflict that would become almost impossible to stop. Let's take a look at the very first domino to fall. Okay, so that first domino was this fundamental and honestly kind of bizarre flaw in the politics of the time. It all came down to a really strange feudal relationship between the English and French kings. To really get this, you have to rewind the clock, way back to 1066. That's when William the Conqueror, who was the Duke of Normandy over in France, invaded and became the King of England. And that one single event created this tangled political knot that would take, well, centuries to unravel. So here's the crazy part this created. By the 1300s, you have King Edward III. In England, he's the absolute ruler, a sovereign monarch. But for his lands in France, like the super wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, he's technically a vassal. And that meant he was supposed to pay homage, to literally kneel before the King of France. Think about it. A king kneeling to another king. It was a total recipe for disaster. And this wasn't just some awkward, formal ceremony. No, it was a constant source of humiliation and political tension. This whole uneasy relationship was basically a political time bomb, just ticking away, and by the 14th century, it was ready to go off. And the spark that lit the fuse? Well, that was the next domino, a death in the French royal family. This is where a political headache turns into a personal rivalry for the biggest prize of all. All right, picture this. It's the year 1328. The French king is dead, and he has no sons to take his place. Now, in the world of medieval kingdoms, this is a full-blown crisis. The direct line of kings that had ruled France for over 300 years was suddenly broken. And that single question just plunged two entire kingdoms into chaos. The stability of all of Europe kind of depended on getting a clear answer, but, well, there just wasn't one. So two main guys stepped up. The French favorite was Philip of Valois. He was a cousin of the dead king, and his claim was through an all-male line. But England's Edward III had a really strong claim too. He was the late king's nephew, a closer blood relative. The only problem? His claim came through his mother, Isabella. So the French nobles, who really didn't want an English king on their throne, they dig way back into their history books and dust off this old legal idea called Salic law. Basically, they argued it meant the crown could never pass through a woman. And just like that, Edward's claim was out. Philip of Valois was crowned King Philip VI. Now, for the moment, it seemed like the issue was settled. Edward didn't really push it right away. But that idea, that ambition of uniting the crowns of England and France, it had been planted. And it was an insult that was not going to be forgotten. But hey, this war wasn't just about feudal duties and who had royal blood. The third domino was something a lot more down to earth: money, trade, and who controlled the resources. These two kingdoms were just fierce economic rivals. I mean, England's entire economy practically ran on wool, which got shipped to the rich towns in Flanders to be made into cloth, and the French king wanted control of that region badly. Meanwhile, France was constantly messing with the English in Aquitaine, which messed up the very profitable wine trade. And on top of all that, the English Channel was just a hotbed for piracy and naval skirmishes, choking off trade for everyone. And we're not talking about minor disputes here. As you can see, places like Aquitaine and Flanders were absolute economic powerhouses. Controlling them and controlling the trade routes in the Channel meant controlling a staggering amount of wealth and power.
Okay, so we have the feudal tension, we have the dynastic rivalry, and we have the economic competition. All the pieces are on the board. And now we get to the final domino, the one single act that pushed both kingdoms right past the point of no return.
You can see how the pressure was just building and building for years. After Philip got the crown in 1328, he spent the next 10 years just tightening his grip, constantly meddling in Aquitaine. Then, in 1337, he makes his big move. He declares the entire duchy as forfeit. He just seizes it from the English crown. And Philip's justification? He used that very same feudal relationship that had been causing all the problems as his weapon. He declared Edward a disobedient vassal and said that gave him the right to take his lands. This was a direct, aggressive challenge. There was no way Edward could just let it slide. Backed into a corner, Edward fires back with the biggest weapon he's got. He dusts off that old claim to the throne from 1328. He wasn't just asking for Aquitaine back anymore. He went all in, declaring that Philip was a usurper and that he, Edward, was the one and only true king of France. And just like that, the war was on. So you can see how it all came together, right? You've got the dynastic dispute over the crown, the awkward, intense feudal relationship, the fierce economic rivalry, and then the final straw, Philip seizing Aquitaine. All four triggers were now pulled. So now that we've laid out all the causes, let's talk about the consequences. How did this century of conflict actually kick off on the battlefield? Well, the start of the war was an absolute catastrophe for France. England just racked up this string of shocking victories. They won control of the sea at the Battle of Sluys. At Crécy, the English longbowmen completely dominated the French knights. They captured the vital port of Calais. And then, in 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, they did the unthinkable. They actually captured the French king himself. This first, incredibly brutal phase of the war finally ended with a treaty in 1360. But here's the thing. While the fighting stopped for a little while, none of the big issues had actually been solved. The fire hadn't been put out. It was just going to smolder and flare up again for another 100 years. Which really leaves you with a final thought to chew on. When you look at that broken feudal system and all those competing national interests, you have to wonder, was a massive century-long war like this just bound to happen? Or was it really just driven by the personal pride and ambition of two powerful kings who simply refused to back down? That's something to think about. Thanks so much for watching.